everyone for attending this. I'm Snigdha. I'm an accessibility consultant at UserVision, and today we're going to look at accommodating neurodiverse users online. So I'd like to start off with this quote. It's from Professor Ben Schneiderman, who works at the University of Maryland and is a huge proponent for digital accessibility and inclusion. So, technology must be designed to include people with new or old computers, fast or slow networks, large or small screens, young and old, novice and expert, able and disabled, those yearning for literacy, overcoming insecurities, and coping with varied limitations. And this forms the core tenet of digital accessibility as well, and this is what we work towards as accessibility consultants here. Our job is to remove barriers that prevent digital access. The internet is a huge, it provides huge opportunities for education, entertainment, work, but then it's meant to be a level playing field. We want to ensure that it actually is by removing barriers that prevent access. And these barriers can depend on different disability groups. So you have visually disabled users, which include blind or low vision users, motor impaired users, which could be users with arthritis, tremors, or limited fine motor control, auditory impaired users, so this could include deaf or hard of hearing users, users who communicate with using sign language, and finally, users with cognitive disabilities. So why focus on only one disability group? So I'm going to tell you a story about me and one of my friends. Growing up as a socially awkward only child, books used to be my primary source of companionship. Reading was my thing. And this was before the age of brain rot caused by TikTok, Instagram, social media. Back then, I actually could concentrate and I could read almost anything I could get my hands on. Friend, Gurnur, who always had trouble in school because he couldn't read very well. He had trouble with reading assignments, with writing, with homework, and teachers thought he was lazy, that he wasn't motivated enough, or that he was just really, really stubborn. He was my friend. I knew him well enough to know that this wasn't the case. He was motivated, he wasn't lazy, but I didn't understand why he couldn't read. This was something that was a very integral part of my life, and I just couldn't understand why he wasn't able to achieve the same things. I'm sure we all have stories like this, either from our own personal experiences or based on just related to people we know. It wasn't until much later that I realized, well, Gurnur couldn't read very well because he had dyslexia. It wasn't that he couldn't grasp concepts. It wasn't that, well, he was lazy. It was just that letters, alphabets, words, he couldn't process them very well when they were written down. If you explained it to him, if you had a conversation with him, he was fine. But then reading was difficult. But we didn't find this out until much, much later. And that's a problem with cognitive disabilities. They tend to go undiagnosed, they tend to be underrepresented, and they're not prioritized very often. Even until recently, if you talked about accessibility or disability, the first icon that would pop up would be a person in a wheelchair. Because when we talk about accessibility, we tend to think about the more physical or the more visible ones. Even in terms of digital accessibility, when we're talking about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, conducting audits, we tend to prioritize screen reader users, users navigating with a joystick or a keyboard. Because cognitive disabilities are more to do with how the brain processes things, people don't tend to focus on them that much, which is why we're focusing on just cognitive disabilities today, because they are underrepresented and we need to talk about them more. So what are cognitive disabilities? Diagnosable conditions that affect an individual's ability to think, process, reason, and learn. And the key point here is that they are diagnosable. They need a medical diagnosis, and thus this will result in the person being diagnosed with that condition. To get a better insight into how they would affect users on the web, it's worth understanding some of the different types of cognitive disabilities and impairments. So we start out with learning disabilities. These are difficulties in the areas of reading, writing, maths, or organizational skills. This can include dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyscalculia, and executive function disorder. Then you have the autism spectrum disorder. The term disorder is quite controversial right now. Is it a disorder? Is it a condition? But at the moment, it's called autism spectrum disorder. That's what we'll call it now. But be aware that language is changing. So individuals with ASD might have difficulty with social skills, language, communication. They might exhibit repetitive behavior and restricted interests. Then you have ADHD. So this affects a person's ability to pay attention, control impulsive behavior, and regulate hyperactivity. It may result in difficulties with organizing, staying focused, managing time, and impulses. Then you have intellectual disabilities. These are characterized by limitations in intellectual functioning, such as learning and problem solving, communication, and social skills. Some specific examples might be fetal alcohol syndrome and Down syndrome. This, again, that it's a scale on how much it affects a person. Some people might be very highly affected, whereas others might be slightly less affected and might have workarounds and still integrate normally into society without major difficulties. Then you have sensory processing disorders. So these are difficulties with how the brain processes information received through the senses, such as sight, smell, sound, touch, taste. So this can include photosensitivity, which is hyper or hyposensitivity to light, auditory sensitivity. People might get distracted by loud noises. I'm not sure if you've heard of this before, but a lot of neurodivergent users hate fluorescent lights because it can be very bright, triggering photosensitivity, but also the noise emitted by lights can be very distracting or even painful to them. And then you also have cognitive impairment due to aging. So this refers to the natural decline in cognitive abilities that occur as a natural part of aging, but it can also include specific medical conditions like Alzheimer's and dementia. 1 in 10 people have some type of cognitive disability, and with an aging population, this is only going to increase because, well, we aren't getting younger. Our brains are not getting any better. Okay, but what about neurodiversity? What the talk is called after all. Well, I've used the term cognitive disabilities rather liberally here, but it's not the most inclusive when talking about serving the widest range of people. So this brings us to the term neurodiversity. In its essence, neurodiversity refers to the fact that all of our brains are unique, just like fingerprints. Some brains process things a bit more differently to others. Neurodiversity includes different conditions and cognitive variations. It includes typical as well as not very typical brains. It includes diagnosable conditions, but it also goes beyond that to refer to people who would still benefit from adaptations, but they might not have a proper diagnosis just yet. It's more than just a politically correct term, because cognitive disabilities, when you say that, it's often looking at it through the medical lens, where the focus is on diagnosis, on the impairment, and then a medical solution. Whereas neurodiversity reframes these differences as individual differences in ability, and they're not disorders. So it's an inclusive term that recognizes that we're all diverse and individuals' brains and cognitive abilities can vary. So the terms can be a bit confusing at first, so let's break it down a bit more. So you have cognitive disabilities, which include the list of conditions that we just looked at. Cognitive disabilities can include learning difficulties such as dyslexia, dyscalculia, but there are learning difficulties that might not be part of those diagnosable conditions. Similarly, attention difficulties, ADHD might be a diagnosable condition, but then you have other conditions that might not result in a medical diagnosis. All of this results in what's called the neurodivergent brain. Compare this with neurotypical. So people who are neurodivergent, their brains process things a bit more differently to neurotypical brains. Not saying this is wrong, this is right, one is more correct than the other. It's just that this tends to be the more typical way, just because that's probably how the majority of the brain of us process things, or that's what was ages ago. It was decided that that was the right way, and that's just passed down. So that's the neurotypical way. Neurodivergent is those whose brains process it a little more differently and would benefit from adaptations being made. All of this comes under the spectrum of neurodiversity. So neurodiversity is a term that recognizes that everyone's brains are different. Neurodivergent individuals are those who would process things a bit more differently to neurotypicals. Now let's look at some numbers. So we've already seen that 10% of people have some cognitive disability. So these are the diagnosable conditions. However, reports suggest that maybe 15 to 20% of the global population is neurodivergent. And this can be for, 10% can be further classified in this way. So about 10% with 10% of that 10% with dyslexia, 2 to 5% with ADHD, 1 to 2% with autism, 5 to 7% with dementia. But then neurodivergent users, that's a whole lot bigger. And the thing is, we already saw that neurodivergence and cognitive disabilities tend to be underdiagnosed. A lot of adults right now have lived through their entire lives without ever receiving a diagnosis. They wouldn't be included in the statistic, but they would be neurodivergent, and that's not included. So this number is probably, all these numbers are probably going to be a lot larger than what current statistics tell us. And we're hoping to see an uptick, not an uptick in numbers, but an uptick in terms of diagnosis, in terms of recognizing neurodivergence, because, well, we're hoping for a lot more awareness now. Small steps like this. So now let's look at some of the common problems neurodivergent users face online. These can range from design barriers to complex language to a lack of accessibility features. And this can limit opportunities for online learning, communication, or just access to information. So let's look at this one. Some of you might have already seen the dyslexia simulator in the other room, but for the benefit of those who didn't, this is what it looks like. What this video is going to show you right now is a simulation of what reading might be like for a user with dyslexia. Note that this is not a blanket statement. This is not trying to replicate lived experience. It's just trying to simulate what it might be like for readers for whom words jumble up, letters switch around, and for whom larger words might be a little more difficult to process. So what this plugin is doing is just switching letters around to show you that things are more difficult to read. And you might notice that things are not impossible to read, especially when you have the context that's on this web page. It's just a lot harder. Smaller words are easier. Smaller sentences, when they're broken down, it again makes it easier, especially because you're getting more context, whereas larger blocks of text like this one can take more time to read. And this is a problem that dyslexic users, users with reading difficulties, users with attention difficulties can encounter. This is some lack of media alternatives can affect neurodivergent users as well as hard of hearing users, as well as more typical users in certain situations. So some users with cognitive processing difficulties might find videos easier to understand when there's that visual representation of the spoken word. So it's like an additional layer, an additional input layer for some users. Some users might find videos distracting and find it easier to process written words and written text. They might focus only on the subtitles. And then talking about therefore hard of hearing users, this is integral for them to actually access content. Moving on to my favorite thing to talk about, CAPTCHAs. Who likes CAPTCHAs here? No. So CAPTCHAs, they are pretty well renowned in the accessibility world for being kind of bad. And there have been ways to try and improve them. So select all squares with buildings. If that's a little hard, why don't you try solving a maths problem? Too much for you? Try to interpret what these letters mean, or press play and enter the numbers you hear. There are different ways of trying to solve these captchas, but all of them are pretty bad, and most of them are inaccessible. Here's my favorite example sent to me by one of my colleagues. Please click on the largest animal. Who wants to have a go? Which one? Yep, it's the giant red squirrel. You got it right. The best part is that captcha, it's not on some random obscure website. It is from, I think it's Whistlebinkies, the bar in Edinburgh. And this is what users have to complete to order more drinks. I feel like there's a problem here. You do not want your patrons, probably already tipsy, to solve puzzles to get more alcohol. So maybe you do. Well, yeah, that's like, you've had too much. Solve this now. Oh, maybe it is. Maybe that's the hidden use case. Cluttered content. This is what Craigslist looks like right now. It's pretty cluttered, not the easiest in terms of finding things. And that's a Swedish website, I think, for hardware. So some websites, they might implement loud graphics and cluttered content as a stylistic choice. Not only does this affect the user experience of the site, but then these choices can make things very inaccessible, very distracting for users with cognitive difficulties. It's visually distracting, it's challenging to locate information, and it's just challenging to navigate. And this in turn affects the readability, which then increases the cognitive fatigue, which can make for an overwhelming, confusing, even painful experience for neurodivergent users, especially for users with ADHD. Speaking of cognitive overload, this is a simulator for what ADHD might look like. I really like this one blog of someone I read who said having ADHD is like having 4 different radio channels in your head, one for the current task at hand, one for background processes, one for the next project, and one just playing music. And this sort of simulates that. It is a little sensationalized. So again, not trying to replicate or say this is what ADHD is like, but just to give maybe a flavor of what it might be.
Really good that I forgot garbage bags last time I was at the grocery store. Well, I'm going to have to go and do that first. Where are my keys? That book was too bad for the library. Okay. So much to do this communication. This book, something about something that has.
So that can be like what it is for someone with ADHD. And then you have timeouts. So neurodivergent individuals often require additional time to process information and execute tasks efficiently. Now, this doesn't mean that as soon as someone enters your website, it's like, are you neurodivergent? Do you need more time? It's just trying to limit the number of timeouts and time-sensitive processes that are there. Because when you have timeouts, especially something like this, where it's like you have only this much time to complete your purchase, to complete your whatever action you're trying to achieve, that adds to the stress and anxiety that's probably already there from using a website. It can also affect the flow of work, leading to frustration and confusion, because not only are you imposing that additional layer of confusion and anxiety, you're now also affecting what might have been a linear workflow by imposing time limits. Whereas if you have something like a session timeout where you've got the option to extend the amount of time, that's better because it's giving users that freedom of choice. It's letting them make that decision for themselves. Luckily, WCAG, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, helps. We've already looked at WCAG 3.2. Now let's come back to WCAG 2.2, which is where we're currently at. So the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is the de facto standard for accessibility. The latest version was WCAG 2.2, which was it October 23? We're going to say October 23. So what this has is 86 success criteria, 55 to meet at level AA. So the way these guidelines are structured are in 3 levels. So you have level A, which is very basic accessibility. Your images have alt tags. Can keyboard users actually access your website? Then you have level AA, which is slightly broader in terms of its features, but then still important. And then you have level AAA, which, well, nobody cares about that, so I'm not even going to mention it. It's seen as this highly unachievable level of accessibility, and because it's not legally required to meet that, they just tend to go unnoticed. So, as Kevin White mentioned earlier, there are success criteria within WCAG that do help neurodivergent individuals. So I've broken them down into a few categories. So first we have solid structure. So solid structure refers to the organization and arrangement of content, navigation, and elements on a page in a clear, logical, and user-friendly manner. This enables neurodivergent individuals to navigate and comprehend the information more easily. When it's structured, when the content is structured more effectively, this promotes wayfinding, which is navigating and finding the information that you're looking for. And it also helps them engage with the content more effectively. I like the term wayfinding because it's similar to how people navigate in the real world using landmarks, maps, signposts. That's sort of the similar experience you're trying to have on your website, just making sure people can find their way to the information or the action they need more effectively. So some of the criteria that promotes a solid structure are WCAG 1.3.2, which ensures, so that's meaningful sequence, which ensures that all content on a website is organized in a logical structure to aid understanding. Then you have identify input purpose. So some of you might have seen with the screen reader example that if the input purpose isn't identified, that's if you're trying to fill out a form and it's not if you don't know what that form is for, why would you fill it out? How do you go about it? What are you supposed to put in there? So it doesn't affect just visually impaired users when you have forms or fields which don't have instructions related to them, which don't have proper, but you don't know what the actual purpose of that input is, then it just makes it difficult and confusing to finish. Link purpose, that's something that most of us are probably a little more aware of. You want to navigating via links helps. Links on a page gives you a better idea of what the structure is. It highlights what other content is related, what actions can be completed. But those links themselves need to be informative. If you've got a single page with read more, read more, read more, read more, read more about what are you actually trying to do? So having the purpose of that link is identified early on is important so that users are able to make that informed decision. They know where they're going before actually clicking on it. And another thing is headings and labels. So like we said, brain rot, no one has time to read a lot of content anymore. So having headings on a page helps you quickly identify what content is related to what, how that page is structured, and how to quickly locate information. The next slide is on, the next bit is on predictable content. So you want your websites, your services, your platforms to be predictable. You don't want to have sudden jack-in-the-box surprises for users. And some of the criteria from the guidelines that relate to that are on focus and on input. What that means is if you focus on a particular field or if you submit a particular button, it is an expected action that occurs. You don't say click next on a form and suddenly it's actually submitted your credit card information to the government. That's an unexpected behavior, which we want to avoid, but also bringing it back a little in terms of more relatable user experience. It's just if you click next on a form, you'd expect to go to the next page of that form and not to a completely new website. So just trying to be as predictable as possible. Similarly, you have consistent navigation and consistent identification. You are trying to align with users' mental models. They come to your page, they've got a pre-existing mental model, they're using your website a little more, now they have a better understanding of how it works. They know that clicking on the logo on the left is the home, takes you back to the home page, hamburger menu on the right opens that menu. They're forming that mental model. It makes moving through the website easier because it's not something you constantly remember. Now you're just getting used to it. On the fifth page, you completely switch things up. That's going to affect your user because now they have to learn a new way of processing things. They have to locate for information. They have to locate information that they were used to seeing in one place. Now it's somewhere else. So having that consistency is very useful for all users, but particularly for neurodivergent users, since you're reducing the amount of cognitive stress involved. This is similar to what we saw earlier in terms of instructions. So providing enough instructions for the user so that they understand what is expected of them when navigating through a website. This also includes errors. So if you've got a form, the form has errors, make sure users know what those errors are, have them identified, and also give them tips on how to actually solve them. Don't just have click next, error, without letting them know what it is, because you're trying to comfort them, you're trying to actually help them through the process. You're not just pointing out that something's wrong, you're actually trying to help them resolve it. Alternative formats. So some users would benefit from different formats in terms of perceiving information. It might not be that they can't perceive information in a certain way. It just might be that they have a different learning style. So with the example of captions, some users might prefer having audio supplemented with text. Some people might prefer just seeing the text version. In terms of images and videos or animations on a website, those can be very distracting for some users. So having the opportunity for them to hide all animations, hide all images, but still receive that information is important. And finally, time and user control. So this is related to the timeout example that we saw earlier, because implementing time-based restrictions and for content interactive forms can induce additional stress for users, particularly for those users who might require more time to actually comprehend and finish the task. So WCAG 2.2, that has criteria for time-sensitive controls. So timing adjustable, let users adjust the time that they need, either by giving them an option to extend the time that by giving them an option to extend the time that they have on a task, or by using by default a large enough time limit. So instead of saying, and this is something you might have noticed with one-time passcodes. I remember earlier you used to have to finish it within a minute. You get a code, that code would expire in a minute, whereas now it's more like 5 minutes, some say 10, some say 20. And that's because of stuff like this, because websites, organizations are trying to be more accessible by default. And then you have pause, stop, hide. So this is more related to multimedia controls, giving users the opportunity to pause, to stop, or hide so that they're not distracted, or they can choose when to perceive that information. But WCAG is great, but then it's not enough, because that's not these conditions, these criteria that we saw earlier, they're good for covering some things, but they're not the most inclusive in terms of all neurodivergent conditions. And a lot of criteria that are related to more cognitive accommodations, they tend to be marked as level AAA, which not many people are even looking at. Things like reading level, having subsection headings, all of these are level AAA. So it doesn't matter if the content on your page is completely illegible unless you have a PhD in physics. It will still pass in terms of an accessibility check. Additionally, neurodivergent users, they have diverse needs, preferences, and abilities. A one-size-fits-all approach, which is sort of suggested by WCAG, would not be beneficial because it doesn't cater to the individual requirements of the group. So how can we fix those? What are some things you need to consider outside of WCAG? Well, the first one is language and tone. The words you're using, to how you're actually framing those sentences. So let's start by avoid using complex language. So instead of saying, utilize the multifaceted parameters to elucidate the nuances of the subject matter, you can just say, consider different aspects to understand the details of the topic. It's still presenting that same information. It still means the same thing, but then by using words that people are more familiar with, by using language that's simpler, you're making it better for everyone to understand. One thing that has been noted is using direct communication helps, especially when in terms of taking actions on a website. So instead of saying it's recommended that one should assess the feasibility prior to making a decision, changing it up to you should assess if this is feasible before proceeding makes that communication more direct. It makes the content more personable. It feels like the user now has a better understanding of what they need to do as opposed to some vague third person. Similar to that is using the active voice. So instead of saying the report should be reviewed by the team before it is submitted, switching it up just a little to say the team should review the report before submitting it. Changing the focus on who is actually performing the action might seem like a small change, but then it does benefit in terms of showing who's doing what they're doing, and what action is being performed. Then using verbs for calls to action. So an evaluation of the situation is necessary. Seems fine enough, but then if you change it to use verb-focused language, so action-focused language, to say evaluate the situation. Similar to using direct communication and active voice, this is again making it more personable, more user-focused. It's not a vague third person. It is directly addressing the user or the reader of your website. And finally, phrasing instructions using if-then structures. So you might encounter difficulties if you don't follow the procedure. Rephrasing it to using if-then structure, saying if you don't follow the procedure, then you might encounter difficulties. This switch up makes things a little better because it's first focusing on the action and then the outcome. So it's just changing the language a little to focus on what will actually happen if you don't perform this action. So these seem like simple changes, except for perhaps the first one. I don't think any of us are actually talking like that. I hope not. But then these simple changes can make content easier and more engaging. Next, moving on to fonts and typefaces. So the choice of font on a website can affect the readability of the text. So that's the font type space, the letter spacing, the line height, the styling. All of this can have an impact on readability. So aspects to be mindful of: using sans serif fonts by default makes things a lot easier to read. So sans serif fonts like Arial, Verdana, and Calibri, these are fonts that don't have the little line on top. So such as Times New Roman. Most printed books use a serif font, so you'll see the little lines on top, whereas sans serif fonts are more rounded and distinct. Now, this is useful for, this is highly recommended for all digital content because it makes things easier to read, but especially for users with dyslexia or reading difficulties, because we saw how letters can sometimes switch around, flip around. Using a sans serif font helps change that because it's making each letter distinct. You don't have lines that might actually blur them together, so it prevents letters from blending in together. Fun fact, Comic Sans is supposed to be one of the most accessible fonts out there by default, so that's what you should all be using. You don't have to change your entire website to use Comic Sans or Open Dyslexic or one of the dyslexia-friendly fonts. What you do need to be aware of is allowing users to customize their needs. Again, this doesn't mean that your website, your service needs to provide a list of fonts that users can change, because users might have their own plugins to change the font, to change how things are seen. What you do need to be aware of and what you do need to provide is when those changes are implemented, making sure that nothing gets lost, that your site is responsive, that content is still presented correctly, it doesn't flow out of the viewport, you don't need horizontal scrolling. It's just making sure that responsive design is implemented correctly so that when users make their changes, your content is still accessible. So I mentioned dyslexia-friendly fonts earlier. This is one of them. So this is called Open Dyslexic. It's based on research working with dyslexic students. What is good about this font is that it's bottom weighted. So you can see that the letters, they've got heavier bottoms. And this helps prevent letters from flipping around. Each letter is also very distinct because for users with dyslexia, P's, B's, Q's, and mother letter, which looks like that, can seem very similar, whereas in this one, they're very distinct. And what that happens is what helps is then users can recognize each letter individually. So because they're so distinct, there's less chance of readers mixing them up. Now moving on to visual presentation. So at a glance, which one do you think is easier to read? This one? Yeah. And could you tell me why that is? Why is it easier for you? Line spacing? Mm-hmm. Anything else? Color? Headings? Sorry? Uh-huh. Honking. Like that word. Uh-huh. So yeah, perfect. I think that's almost everything I wanted to say on the slide, so moving on. Well, not really. So just to re-emphasize whatever everyone said, the line spacing, because it's spaced out between each line, it makes it a lot easier to read. Left align text, because what that results in is these ragged right edges, and that helps users know where one line ends and the other begins. It makes that flow of reading a little easier. Chunking, which is how content has been spaced out. So instead of one huge block of text, it's now each idea, each category is presented in its own paragraph. And then headings and colors to bring that visual attention, bring attention to that component. So what this helps, what presenting content in this way helps is with supporting F-shaped reading. So that's when users read just the first bit of content, scan down, and then until something else catches their eye, they just keep going down. So in this example, it might be the first line of content, moving down, second line of content because there's a heading, there's bold text, and then moving down, and then because there's a bulleted text, that might be the next thing that catches their eye. So it's trying to support that skimming behavior for all users, but especially for neurodivergent users, because attention, reading, learning, all of these might be a little more challenging for them. So by presenting content in this way with the most important ideas first, using headings effectively, using left aligned text, line spacing, can all be very beneficial. So Goldilocks and the three bears of line spacing. So a question I was asked earlier is what is important by default, because some people might prefer a lot more content on a page. Some people might prefer it a little more spaced out. What you want is to try to find that middle ground to be the most inclusive by default, by accommodating as many users as possible at first, because then they can implement changes on their own. So you want to avoid too much white spacing, too little white spacing. You want to be like little baby bear where it's perfect, just in the middle, just right. One other thing to note is striping for tables. So tables can make things easier or difficult to read for users, but for one thing that makes it a little easier for everyone is by using alternative colors, because what that helps with is when you've got especially large tables, you can immediately identify, okay, 500,000. It helps with not moving through different rows. 500,000 is blue and it's related to men. So it helps with categorizing that information a bit easier than just locating information. My manager called this the EDI chart for Middle Earth. Sorry, DEI. And images and multimedia. So these are some instructions for building a shelf. It might not be completely impossible to follow these, but then you probably need to read things multiple times over. And I, for one, just love reading something 4 times over until I actually understand it. You understood that was sarcasm, probably because of the tone, but then is there some way we could bring it out through text? A little emoji. So the point I'm making here is supplementing text with images can be really useful because you're now aligning to different means of learning. So you've got the image to supplement the text, and now you're helping visual learners, text-based learners, as well as users who would benefit from having both means of inputs. And finally, awareness and sensitivity. So one thing about neurodivergence is, which makes it different from cognitive disabilities, is that it also understands that mental health can affect how users process things, how brains process things. So for some users, unfamiliar layouts, unpredictable navigation, overwhelming content can be a cause of anxiety. When it comes to the content itself, certain triggering themes or language could be upsetting for users. Even aspects like brain fog can be triggered by mental or physical conditions, which then again, in turn, affects their mental well-being online. And this can discourage users from engaging with the platform entirely. So some things to consider, which again might tie in with some of the WCAG and beyond WCAG aspects we saw earlier, are ensuring consistent layouts, because that helps reinforce the mental model that's being built. Simple navigation, because it helps you find information more easily, more quickly. Providing contacts for assistance. This can be in terms of if they need assistance in terms of triggering or sensitive content, but also if they just need assistance to use that website a little more effectively. Use trigger warnings if necessary, and use inclusive language by default, because digital inclusion is not just about physical disabilities. It's also about trying to be as inclusive as possible for all users, neurodivergent, neurotypical, which is why this is about accommodating neurodiverse and not neurodivergent users. And that brings us to the end of this quick presentation. So the thing is, acknowledge that there's more to accessibility than visible disabilities. Understand that the challenges faced by neurodivergent individuals. This involves talking to more people, giving neurodivergent people a voice, looking things up online, and most importantly, not making assumptions based on your own experiences. Even if you're neurodivergent, somebody else who's neurodivergent will not be facing the same challenges as you are. Ensure that products or services are WCAG compliant. Even though I did complain about the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, they are our holy Bible in the accessibility world, and making sure you're compliant will ensure that you're at least that much more accessible than normal. That said, recognize the importance of going beyond the guidelines in order to be truly inclusive, as neuro-inclusive as possible. Accommodate different preferences while being accessible and usable by default. The goal is to be as accessible as default by catering to the widest range of users, but then also recognizing that personal preferences may vary, and try to accommodate as many changes that users might make on your site. And finally, keep learning more and spreading awareness. And in terms of learning more, got a little plug-in here. So if you're interested in more training offered by User Vision, we've got some courses here. You can scan this QR code right up on the screen there. Just before I get back on that screen, we do have some resources, which I'll link to in a moment. So these are some really helpful resources in terms of learning more about neurodiversity. And these are more of plugins and tools that you can use to see what neurodivergent users or different users might be using to try and simulate the different conditions, or just seeing what kind of tools and resources are available. There we go. If anyone wants to scan, I am meant to do this plugin. But yeah, no, some of these courses, all of these courses are really good. I know that and I know that as a fact because they're delivered by my lovely colleagues here. And yes, that's me. Thank you all for being here. Any questions?
One of the things that I really found interesting was how you're talking about not just how we can present accessible content for people with disabilities, but how we can also offer adjustments. So how would you, I guess, recommend that? Like, it's quite easy for visual disabilities to change font size, figures, change colors, and things like that. But when we're presenting these sorts of same settings, do users, how do we catch, what's really going to be useful for those?
So some of the things we mentioned here is the stuff like using accessible fonts, trying to make sure language is the language is as inclusive as possible, structuring your content effectively. Those are probably the most impactful ones. But then if you're able to work with your users, if you're able to conduct usability testing, get feedback from actual users to see what's important to them, that can also be helpful. Thanks. Anything else? Do you have anything online? Don't think so.
I suppose it's customization as well, like alternative
Mm-hmm.
content, or give the ability for your user to customize their own experience, then theoretically they'll be able to make that experience benefit them rather than just being generic. So customization.
Yeah, customization. But even I guess at what point do you give the onus is on the user to figure out what's best for them when they get to your website? So, for example, like an accessibility tool where they are meant to set the font size when they arrive at the website. They're meant to set the font colors, everything that they set up as they arrive on the website can probably be more, I'm imagining, stressful for them if they are meant there to like set everything up. But again, flexibility is good. I guess it's nuanced on how you're
By default with customization. Also, just on that, accessibility overlays. Those seem like they might make things accessible by providing font different color options, but then they're not great. They mess up with assistive technologies. They don't work well with screen readers. Not work great for joystick or keyboard users. That's just a random thought I had because I hate your accessibility overlays. Anything else?
Content types where, say for an example, you're having a how-to guide, there might be the video, but you've got step-by-step underneath. But I can see that some people would prefer to listen to that as a podcast, or as you say, have a set of downloadable instructions, have that. So, but that is also a challenge because you're creating many different forms of content potentially that you then have to manage also. So that is hard. I suppose you've got to try and figure out which forms are most useful, and also do you allow someone to say, I don't want videos on my podcast, or they do it on a page by page basis, but I guess it's figuring out how those alternatives will work.
I think the thing about where we are in terms of technology now is a lot of it can be semi-automated. So for videos, you have automatic transcription and subtitling tools. So instead of you having to go and create them from scratch, you can use those and then come back and verify just to make sure the words have been recognized. It is. So technology is not all bad.
You'll be offering them the ability to give feedback or provide their feedback on the page as they're going through. So you provided these alternatives, but it's very useful. And I think they feel that they're able to use the feedback feature on the website. So giving them the opportunity to say, is there something else that you wanted, that you were looking for, will help you understand as well. I think I'll wrap up there.
But thank you.